So, we're now getting on to the cognitive problems and dementia. Who can tell me what the difference is between cognitive impairment and dementia? And no one's telling me because there's no answer to that. Actually, it's very, very difficult to draw the line between a cognitive impairment and an early dementia. Who's to say? After 30, how many brain cells do we lose every day? 100,000? Depends what you drink. And if you're a TV cameraman, it's probably 150, 200. But 100,000 brain cells are lost after the age of 30 every day. Frightening, really. And that's in the normal person. 10 to 15% of people over 65 will have significant intellectual impairment. And 50% of those will have severe intellectual impairment. If you draw a graph of severity against age, it's linear. So with increasing age, the more severe, on average, becomes the cognitive decline. This will affect about 2% of the population in the UK, 1 in 5 people over the age of 80. How many people are we talking about? Well, according to the Alzheimer's Society, currently there are 800,000 people, patients, with dementia in this country, and we reckon that about half of those haven't been diagnosed. So they're out there. Nearly 500,000 people are out there in the UK. You'll be seeing some of them. They've got dementia of varying degrees, but they haven't got a diagnosis yet. And don't make the mistake of thinking that you have to be over 65 to have dementia, because there are 17,000 people under the age of 65 who've been diagnosed, and the real incidence could be 3 times higher than that. So in younger people, they're losing their faculties slowly, and some of those signs and symptoms won't be obvious to people who haven't got a medical background, but it's becoming obvious to friends and relatives and people who know them. So when does cognitive decline change into dementia? What's the dividing line? How do we make the diagnosis? And for many people, particularly medical students and nurses who train in hospitals, the first encounter they have with older people might be there in their training. So they don't actually know what is normal. Like, what's normal for a 65? What's normal for a 75-year-old? What is their normal mental function expected to be like? And that, for some people, is quite difficult until you've got the experience. After the age of 55, there is a physiological change in the nervous system, and there is some physiological decline in intellectual capacity. Tasks that require speed, mental agility, tend to be affected most. And as the years go by, we get more easily thrown by irrelevant material. So if we're hearing something in speech or reading something, we're distracted by the irrelevant material. We find it more difficult to focus on what's really important. And we tend to perform worse in intelligence tests than younger people, partly because we might have less interest in those intelligence tests if we've got a bit of cognitive decline, and partly because older people may not have had the opportunities in education that we've all had. So there are many reasons why intelligence tests are not necessarily a particularly good way of assessing people's cognitive function. Sometimes there are barriers with communication with older people, socioeconomic barriers, cultural barriers. So young professional helpers can find it difficult to relate to older clients, and we have to adapt and be sensitive to that. The medical approach, can't be using that much medical approach to dementia is we might use these mental function tests. You've all heard of doctors asking older people to do serial sevens. Anybody familiar with serial sevens? If I looked at, it's Kate, isn't it? If I said, can you count from 100 backwards, taking off 7 at a time? Have a go. 100?
93. 79.
Exactly. So we can ask people to do those mental function tests, which is fine. It gives us an idea of whether they can calculate. We can also ask them about recent memory. Long-term memory is retained in dementia, but short-term memory is often lost quite early on. So if I asked you what you had for dinner last night, you'd have a little think and you'd be able to tell me. Yeah? But if you asked somebody with early dementia, they might not remember what they had for breakfast or for lunch. So it's short-term memory. What was just said on the TV, if the TV's on, but they might not remember that. So we can ask them about that. We can ask them where they live, what the month, what the year is. Don't make the mistake of doing what a lot of young doctors do, and they say to a patient, where are you in this? They're in a hospital, and they say, where are you? And the patient says, I don't know, and they're written off as demented. Whereas in fact they were probably bundled into an ambulance the week before, and no one told them which hospital they were going to. So they have no reason to know where they are. No one's told them. So you've got to assume, until proved otherwise, that they do have mental function. They do know what's going on. It may be that the system has failed them and hasn't informed them. But anyway, what's more important than whether they can calculate downwards from 100 by taking 7 off at a time, and whether they know who the Deputy Prime Minister is, what's more important is what their level of social competence is. So when you look around their home, is it squalor? Is the whistle blowing on the kettle in the kitchen, and has it been whistling for 25 minutes because they've forgotten and they can't hear it? Are there clothes over the electric fire, which are a fire risk? It's looking for clues of social incompetence, which is more important than being able to calculate short-term memory. Do they have a realistic grasp of how they're coping at home? Ask yourself whether they look as if they're in charge of the home, whether it's safe, or whether they could do with some help. Are they familiar with the interview that's taking place with you? Do they really know what it's about? Or have they forgotten since making the appointment? So you can tactfully probe. Ask yourselves whether they're giving a good account of themselves, or whether they're confabulating. Confabulation is a great medical word. It means that they make stuff up so that they disguise the fact that they've lost their memory. So if you say to somebody with early dementia who's aware that they're losing their faculties but they're ashamed about it, you say, where is your pet that I saw last time? They say, yeah, same place. They haven't got a clue what's happened there. Maybe the pet's gone off with the grandson or the granddaughter, but I'll say the same place as last time. They're very good at filling in the gaps. So just be aware of that. Confabulation means that you have to ask specific questions and maybe probe a little bit further. You can, yes, are they depressed? It's very easy to confuse depression with dementia. It's very, very common in the early stages of dementia to become anxious and depressed. I mean, can you imagine you begin to realise, having been a fully functional, intelligent person, holding down a good job, having a family, and suddenly it's all changed. And you are so anxious about what's going to happen to you. You don't want to admit to anybody that you can't remember things, that you're forgetting where you put your keys. Worse than forgetting where you put your keys, you find them in the fridge. Somebody once said to me, the difference between dementia and loss of short-term memory because you're stressed is because you know, if you're stressed, you put your keys down anywhere and you'll find them on the coffee table or under a magazine. If you're demented and you forget where the keys are, you might find them in the fridge, where they've never been put in the first place. So it's things like that which are quite helpful. And eccentricity is another feature of early dementia, but when does it become part of normal aging and when is it part of dementia? When I talk about eccentricity, it's about that squalor that someone starts to live in. They've been neat and tidy with good personal hygiene all their life, and suddenly, you know, you've got clothes discarded all over the place, toilets which aren't flushed, you've got, you know, things on the stove which are boiling over. It's this self-neglect, and it's been called the Diogenes syndrome. Anyone know who Diogenes was? I didn't till this morning. He was a Greek philosopher who was noted for his contempt of social niceties. So I imagine he was a bit like Rabsy Nesbitt or Paul Gascoigne. Pseudo-dementia is what we call this Diogenes syndrome. It's not true dementia, but it is a feature of cognitive decline. And when you challenge these people living in squalor, the neighbours complain about the state of their front garden or the rubbish all over the place, they will be totally unrepentant and quite obstinate about it and increasingly suspicious, but they're not actually yet demented at that stage. And often that sort of thing occurs after a bereavement. And again, it's quite relevant to ask about spouses, partners, friends and family. So people are living longer. More of your clients will have cognitive decline and signs of early dementia. The important thing is to pick it up as soon as you can. And remember that you will be seeing them more than once, I'm sure, for consultations, and there can be a change between the two consultations. That won't necessarily be your fault. So that if they appeared quite normal on day one and you see them 30 days later, you might see a change. You might see that they're not as sharp and as inquisitive as they were a month ago. And there may be lots of reasons for that. But if you pick that up and you're able to talk to a relative or even to the client themselves, then it's worth discussing, because there are often things you can do to start off that process whereby there can be an intervention. But certainly you don't want to avoid clients that might prove challenging, because you're the ones who can keep them in touch with that reality and the world around them by improving their hearing and bringing back that contact with the outside world.